March 14th, 2023, south side of Chicago, Illinois. A commercial building that had stood since 1958 was undergoing extensive renovation. The structure, a six-story mixed-use building that had housed retail spaces on the ground floor and offices above, had been purchased by a development company planning to convert it into modern apartments. The building's underground parking garage, a relic from an era when underground parking was still a novelty, required significant updates to meet current safety codes and structural standards. Matthew Smith, a construction worker with 15 years of experience in demolition and renovation, was operating a pneumatic jackhammer in the parking garage's lowest level. His task was straightforward: break up sections of the old concrete floor so new drainage systems could be installed and fresh concrete poured. The parking garage had two subterranean levels, and Matthew was working in the deeper of the two, approximately 20 feet below street level. The concrete in most of the garage was standard thickness, 6 to 8 inches, typical for parking structures of that era. Matthew had been breaking through it steadily all morning, the jackhammer doing its work efficiently. But around 11:15 a.m., he encountered a section in the northeast corner of the lower level that was different. The concrete here was significantly thicker, and the jackhammer struggled to penetrate it. Matthew adjusted his position, applied more pressure, and continued working. The concrete was unusually dense and deep. 1 foot down, 2 feet, 3 feet. This wasn't normal. Standard parking garage floors didn't require concrete this thick. Matthew called over his supervisor, Carlos Martinez, to examine the anomaly. Carlos had been in construction for 30 years and had seen his share of unusual building situations. He examined the area, noting that this section of concrete appeared to have been poured separately from the surrounding floor. The edges where this thick section met the regular floor showed clear demarcation, suggesting this wasn't original construction, but rather a later modification or repair. "Keep going," Carlos instructed. "Let's see what's under there. Might be an old utility vault or something they filled in." Matthew resumed work with the jackhammer. At approximately 4 feet deep, the bit struck something that wasn't concrete. There was a metallic clang, a sound distinctly different from concrete breaking. Matthew stopped, cleared away debris, and saw a flash of chrome reflecting in his work lights. Metal. Smooth, curved metal that looked like a car bumper. Matthew and Carlos carefully cleared more concrete by hand, using smaller tools. What emerged over the next 30 minutes was unmistakable: the curved, chrome-plated rear bumper of a vintage automobile. Its distinctive styling characteristic of late 1950s American cars. The chrome was corroded and dulled by decades encased in concrete, but it was clearly a car bumper. The discovery brought work to an immediate halt. Carlos contacted the project manager, who contacted the building owner, who contacted the Chicago Police Department. By 2 p.m., police officers and detectives were on site examining the bizarre find. By 4 p.m., a specialized excavation team had arrived to carefully remove the concrete surrounding what was clearly an entire automobile buried beneath the parking garage floor. The excavation took 3 days, conducted with archaeological precision to preserve evidence and document everything. As the concrete was painstakingly removed, the vehicle gradually emerged, a 1959 Chevrolet Bel Air. Its distinctive tail fins and chrome trim unmistakable even under the grime and corrosion. The chrome was corroded and dulled by decades encased in concrete, but it was clearly a car bumper. The discovery brought work to an immediate halt. Carlos contacted the project manager, who contacted the building owner, who contacted the Chicago Police Department. By 2 p.m., police officers and detectives were on site examining the bizarre find. By 4 p.m., a specialized excavation team had arrived to carefully remove the concrete surrounding what was clearly an entire automobile buried beneath the parking garage floor.
The excavation took 3 days, conducted with archaeological precision to preserve evidence and document everything. As the concrete was painstakingly removed, the vehicle gradually emerged, a 1959 Chevrolet Bel Air. Its distinctive tail fins and chrome trim unmistakable even under the grime and corrosion. The chrome was corroded and dulled by decades encased in concrete, but it was clearly a car bumper. Over the next century later, this story became known as the tale of the buried Bel Air. The find sparked further investigations into the history of the parking garage and the building it served. It revealed that a section of the garage had been repaired in the late 1960s following a fire, and it was believed that the car was buried during this repair process. The details of how and why the car was buried remain shrouded in mystery, and the 1959 Chevrolet Bel Air became a local legend, a tangible link to a forgotten moment in Chicago history.
Carefully cleaned, investigators could see what transformed this from a bizarre discovery into a potential homicide investigation. Skeletal remains in the driver's seat. The remains were clearly visible once the windows were cleaned. A human skeleton sat behind the steering wheel, skeletal hands still positioned near the wheel, the arms supported by the confined space and the hardened material that had surrounded the car for decades. The skeleton wore what appeared to be a suit. The fabric had deteriorated significantly, but enough remained to identify it as formal clothing. The ribcage area showed darker staining that might have been blood, long since dried and aged. Before the car was opened, forensic photographers documented everything from every angle. When the door was finally carefully opened, investigators found the interior remarkably preserved by its concrete tomb. The leather seats were dried and cracked, but intact. The dashboard instruments were corroded, but present. And most significantly, on the skeletal remains and in the car, investigators found several items that would identify both the vehicle and its deceased occupant. A wallet, leather dried to near brittleness, was found in the jacket pocket of the suit the skeleton wore. Inside the wallet was a driver's license, the plastic yellowed and brittle, but the information still legible. Christopher James Giordano, born June 15, 1916, Chicago address on the South Side. The license had been issued in 1959 and showed a photograph of a dark-haired man in his early 40s. The vehicle's registration, found in the glove compartment in a metal document holder that had protected it from complete deterioration, confirmed the car was a 1959 Chevrolet Bel Air, registered to Christopher James Giordano at the same South Side Chicago address. On the skeletal left wrist, investigators found a corroded but recognizable gold Rolex watch, its crystal cracked, but the case intact. On the right hand's ring finger, a gold ring with a diamond remained in place, the stone dulled by decades of grime, but unmistakably valuable. These items, combined with the identification documents, painted a picture of a man of significant means. The discovery made immediate headlines throughout Chicago and quickly gained national attention. A vintage car buried in concrete beneath a parking garage. A skeleton identified as a man who'd been missing since 1961, and most intriguingly, the name Christopher Giordano was familiar to Chicago crime historians and older residents. He had been a known organized crime figure who'd vanished without a trace 62 years earlier. Before we continue with this investigation, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in August 1961 involves organized crime in Chicago, a disappearance that was never solved, and a burial that remained hidden for over 6 decades. By the end, you'll understand how a mob boss vanished and why it took 62 years to find him. The questions investigators faced were both fascinating and grim.
How did Christopher Giordano end up dead in his car beneath 4 feet of concrete? Who had the resources and connections to bury a car and body in a building's basement? And could a 62-year-old murder case possibly be solved? Christopher James Giordano was 45 years old in August 1961, at the height of his power in Chicago's organized crime hierarchy. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with a solid, muscular build that he maintained through regular exercise and physical activity. His hair was dark brown, almost black, worn slicked back in the style popular among men of influence in that era. His eyes were dark brown, described by those who knew him as intense and calculating. He dressed impeccably, favoring expensive suits tailored on Chicago's near North Side, silk ties, and highly polished leather shoes. He wore a gold Rolex watch and a gold ring with a diamond that caught light when he gestured. Christopher had been born in June 1916 in Chicago's Little Italy neighborhood on the near West Side, the son of Italian immigrants who had arrived in America.
In the early 1900s, his father, Antonio Giordano, worked in construction. His mother, Maria, raised Christopher and his 3 siblings in a crowded apartment where Italian was spoken as often as English. Growing up in Little Italy in the 1920s and 30s meant Christopher came of age during Prohibition and the golden era of Chicago organized crime. The neighborhood was controlled by mob families, and young men had essentially 2 paths: legitimate work for low wages or involvement in the lucrative criminal enterprises that dominated the area. Christopher, intelligent and ambitious, chose the latter path while he was still a teenager. By age 18, Christopher was running numbers, operating illegal gambling operations for one of the neighborhood's mob crews. He demonstrated aptitude for the work. He was good with numbers, reliable with money, and understood the importance of keeping accurate records and maintaining good relationships with customers. More importantly, he showed he could be trusted, a crucial quality in an organization where betrayal meant death. Through his 20s, Christopher rose steadily through the ranks of Chicago's organized crime structure. He moved from running numbers to managing larger gambling operations, then expanded into loan sharking, providing high-interest loans to people who couldn't borrow from legitimate sources. By his early 30s, he controlled a significant territory on Chicago's South Side, overseeing gambling, loan sharking, and protection rackets that generated substantial revenue. In 1941, at age 25, Christopher married Margaret Russo, the daughter of another Italian family in the neighborhood. Their marriage was partly romantic, partly strategic. Margaret's family had their own connections in Chicago's underworld, and the union strengthened Christopher's position. They had 2 children, a son, Anthony, born in 1942, and a daughter, Maria, born in 1945. Christopher maintained a careful duality in his life. To his family and in his neighborhood, he was a legitimate businessman who owned a restaurant and invested in real estate. He attended church on Sundays with Margaret and the children. He supported local charities and community organizations. He was seen as a successful Italian-American who'd achieved prosperity through hard work and business acumen. But to those in law enforcement and in the criminal underworld, Christopher was known as a mob boss, controlling significant territory and operations. His legitimate businesses were fronts for illegal activities. His real estate investments were often used for money laundering. His community involvement was partly public relations and partly a way to maintain influence and gather information. Those who worked with Christopher described him as intelligent, calculating, and ruthless when necessary. He could be charming and generous to those who showed him loyalty. He remembered birthdays, attended weddings and funerals, helped families in his territory with financial problems. But he could also be merciless to those who betrayed him, stole from him, or challenged his authority. Several men who'd crossed Christopher had ended up severely beaten
or disappeared entirely. By 1961, Christopher controlled a substantial criminal enterprise generating hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. His territory included much of Chicago's South Side, with gambling operations, loan sharking, and various other illegal activities. He employed dozens of people directly and controlled or influenced many more. He had connections to larger organized crime families in Chicago and maintained relationships with criminal organizations in other cities. But 1961 was also a time of increasing tension and danger. The FBI, under Director J. Edgar Hoover, was intensifying its focus on organized crime. New laws gave federal agents greater powers to investigate and prosecute mob activities. Several major organized crime figures had been arrested and convicted. The pressure was increasing on everyone involved in the underworld. Additionally, internal conflicts within Chicago's organized crime structure were escalating. Territories were being disputed. Younger, more aggressive criminals were challenging older, established figures. Christopher found himself dealing with encroachment on his territory, challenges to his authority, and rumors that some of his own associates were considering betrayal. Christopher owned 2 vehicles. His primary car was a 1960 black Cadillac Eldorado, a massive, luxurious automobile that announced his status and success. He drove the Cadillac to restaurants, clubs, and meetings, enjoying the respect and fear the vehicle commanded. But Christopher also owned a 1959 Chevrolet Bel Air in turquoise, a color officially called frost blue by Chevrolet. The Bel Air was still a nice car, but less ostentatious than the Cadillac. Christopher used it when he wanted to travel less conspicuously, when he needed to meet people without drawing attention, when discretion was more important than display. In early August 1961, those close to Christopher noticed he seemed tense and preoccupied. He had several intense private conversations with trusted associates. He met with people outside his normal circle of contacts. He made several phone calls where he spoke in vague terms about problems that needed to be resolved. Margaret later recalled that Christopher had seemed worried during the first 2 weeks of August, though he'd refused to discuss specific concerns with her, telling her only that he was handling business issues. On August 12, 1961, a Saturday, Christopher seemed to reach some kind of decision. He spent the day at home with Margaret and the children, unusually relaxed for someone who'd been tense all week. They had dinner together that evening. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Christopher told Margaret he needed to take care of some business and would return in a couple of hours. He changed from casual clothes into a suit, dark gray with a white shirt and dark blue tie. He put on his Rolex watch and his diamond ring. He took his wallet, which contained several hundred in cash and various identifications, and critically, instead of taking his Cadillac, Christopher took the turquoise Chevrolet Bel Air. This suggested that wherever he was going, he wanted to travel discreetly rather than conspicuously. The Bel Air was parked in the garage of his South Side home, and Margaret watched from the window as Christopher backed it out and drove away into the August night. That was the last time Margaret Giordano saw her husband alive. That was the last time anyone who would admit to seeing him saw Christopher Giordano. The next morning, the mob boss, who'd controlled significant criminal operations in Chicago for over a decade, had vanished without a trace. August 12, 1961, a Saturday evening in Chicago. The weather that day had been hot and humid, typical for August in the Midwest. Temperature reached 89 degrees Fahrenheit during the afternoon. By evening, it had cooled slightly to the low 80s, with humidity making the air feel thick and heavy. The sky was clear, with no precipitation forecast. It was a normal summer evening in Chicago, with people on their porches trying to catch any breeze, children playing in the streets until dark, families gathering for dinner. Christopher Giordano spent most of Saturday at his home on the South Side. His home was a substantial two-story brick house on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood where many successful Italian-American families lived. The house had been purchased in 1952 as Christopher's criminal enterprises became increasingly profitable. It was a visible symbol of his success, properly maintained with a well-kept lawn and garden that Margaret took pride in. Christopher's teenage children were present that Saturday. Anthony, 19 years old, was home from his first year at college where he was studying business. Maria, 16 years old, was entering her junior year of high school. The family dynamic that day was reportedly normal. Christopher seemed relaxed, more so than he'd been during the previous week. He played cards with Anthony in the afternoon. He helped Maria with some homework she was completing before the fall semester began. He had dinner with the family, Margaret's homemade pasta, a family favorite. Around 9 p.m., Christopher went upstairs and changed clothes. He'd been wearing casual summer clothes, slacks and a short-sleeved shirt, but now he put on a suit. This wasn't entirely unusual. Christopher often conducted business in the evenings and always dressed formally for business meetings, even when they were with criminal associates. Appearance mattered in his world. Respect was signaled through proper dress and behavior. When Christopher came downstairs around 9:25 p.m., Margaret asked where he was going. Christopher's response was vague but not alarming. "Just need to take care of something. Business. I'll be back in a couple hours." He kissed Margaret on the cheek, called goodbye to his children, and went out through the kitchen door that led to the attached garage. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as Christopher started the Chevrolet Bel Air and backed it out of the garage. She noticed he'd taken the Bel Air instead of the Cadillac, which suggested to her that he was meeting someone where he didn't want to draw attention. The Cadillac was conspicuous. The Bel Air was just another par on Chicago streets. Christopher drove away from his home at approximately 9:30 p.m. A neighbor, Henry Benedetto, who lived 3 houses down, was outside watering his lawn and saw Christopher drive past. Henry later told police that Christopher waved at him, that Christopher appeared normal and unhurried. Henry noted the time because his watch showed 9:45 p.m. and he'd been watering his lawn for about 15 minutes, putting Christopher's departure at around 9:30 p.m. That was the last confirmed sighting of Christopher Giordano by anyone who would speak to authorities. He drove away in his turquoise Chevrolet Bel Air and vanished. Margaret expected Christopher home by midnight. When he hadn't returned by 12:30 a.m., she became concerned but not yet alarmed. Christopher sometimes stayed out later than expected if business discussions ran long. By 1:30 a.m., she was worried enough to make a phone call. She called Frank Romano, one of Christopher's closest associates, at his home. Frank, awakened by the late call, told Margaret he hadn't seen Christopher that evening and didn't know where he was. His tone suggested genuine surprise and concern. Margaret then called 2 other associates whose numbers Christopher kept at home. Neither had seen Christopher or knew where he'd gone. Both reacted with what sounded like genuine worry. By 3 a.m. Sunday morning, Margaret was deeply alarmed. Christopher had never stayed out all night without calling, without sending word. Even if business ran late, he found a way to let her know. By 6 a.m., with the sun rising and no word from Christopher, Margaret called his brother Vincent Giordano, who rushed over to the house. Vincent made calls throughout Sunday morning to everyone in Christopher's circle. No one claimed to have seen Christopher on Saturday night. No one knew where he'd gone or who he'd been meeting, or if they knew, they weren't saying. By noon Sunday, it was clear something was seriously wrong. Margaret insisted on calling the police, despite Vincent's concerns that involving authorities might be dangerous, given Christopher's position in the criminal underworld. At approximately 2 p.m. on Sunday, August 13th, Margaret Giordano reported her husband missing to the Chicago Police Department. The responding officers took the report, but didn't initially treat it as urgent. Christopher Giordano was a known organized crime figure. Men in his position disappeared for various reasons: to avoid arrest, to avoid enemies, to conduct illegal business out of state. The officers took the information, including the description of Christopher and his vehicle, and filed the report. But by Monday morning, when Christopher still hadn't appeared and hadn't contacted anyone, the investigation became more serious. Detectives from the Chicago Police Department's Organized Crime Division began interviewing Margaret, Christopher's children, his brother, his known associates. They checked hospitals and jails. They contacted police in other cities. They interviewed informants who might know what had happened, and they found nothing. Christopher Giordano had simply vanished, and so had his turquoise Chevrolet Bel Air. The investigation into Christopher Giordano's disappearance quickly became complicated by the nature of his activities and associations. Chicago Police Department detectives subpoenaed Chicago mob figures who believed he wasn't being aggressive enough in defending his territory or expanding operations. Several informants, speaking confidentially to police, suggested Christopher had been planning some kind of move in early August. Exactly what kind of move was unclear. Perhaps a preemptive strike against rivals, perhaps a negotiation to settle disputes, perhaps something else entirely. But multiple sources indicated Christopher had been preparing for something significant. The FBI became involved in the investigation within days. Christopher Giordano was on their radar as a significant organized crime figure. The FBI had been building cases against various Chicago mob operations, and Christopher was a person of interest in several investigations. FBI agents interviewed the same people Chicago police had interviewed, cross-checked information, and applied federal resources to the search. Both police and FBI investigated several specific theories. Theory 1. Christopher was killed by rival criminal organizations. In 1961, Chicago's criminal underworld was experiencing significant tension as younger, more violent criminals challenged established figures. Several informants suggested that Christopher had been targeted by rivals who wanted to take over his territory. This theory was plausible, but investigators found no physical evidence, no witnesses to any violence, no indication of where such a killing might have occurred. Theory 2. Christopher was killed by his own organization. Sometimes mob bosses were eliminated by their own people when they were seen as weak, when they became legal liabilities, or when someone wanted to take their position. Investigators explored whether Christopher's associates might have turned on him. Again, the theory was plausible, but no evidence emerged. Christopher's closest associates appeared genuinely surprised by his disappearance and concerned about what had happened. Theory 3. Christopher staged his own disappearance. Perhaps he'd learned of impending federal indictments. Perhaps he owed money he couldn't pay. Perhaps he wanted to escape his life and start over elsewhere. Investigators checked his finances, looking for signs he'd been moving money in preparation for flight. They found nothing. His bank accounts were intact. His legitimate businesses continued operating. There was no indication he'd been preparing to disappear. Theory 4. Christopher was arrested under a false name or was killed in an unrelated incident and not identified. Police checked arrest records and unidentified bodies found in Chicago and surrounding areas in August 1961 and the months following. No matches were found. The search for Christopher's turquoise Chevrolet Bel Air was equally fruitless. The car's license plate number and description were distributed to police departments across the Midwest and nationally. The car was distinctive enough that it should have been noticed if it were being driven or abandoned somewhere visible, but no sightings were reported. The Bel Air had vanished as completely as its owner. Investigators explored whether the car had been destroyed. Chop shops, illegal operations that dismantled stolen cars for parts, were questioned. Salvage yards were checked. The Chicago River and surrounding waterways were considered as possible dumping sites, though searching them thoroughly would have been impossible with 1961 technology. Nothing was found. By September 1961, 1 month after Christopher's disappearance, the investigation had essentially stalled. Despite the
Hundreds of interviews, despite FBI resources, despite checking every lead in theory, investigators had found no trace of Christopher Giordano or his vehicle, no body, no car, no witnesses to whatever had happened on Saturday night, August 12th. Margaret Giordano and her children lived in agonizing uncertainty. Was Christopher dead? Was he being held somewhere? Had he abandoned them? Not knowing was in some ways worse than knowing the worst. Margaret couldn't move forward with her life. She couldn't mourn or heal because she had no confirmation of death. She existed in a state of suspended grief. By 1968, 7 years after Christopher's disappearance, Margaret petitioned the court to have her husband declared legally dead. Illinois law at the time required 7 years of absence before a person could be presumed dead without evidence of death. This was necessary for practical reasons, to access life insurance, to manage his estate, to move forward financially and legally. The court granted the petition. Christopher James Giordano was officially declared deceased as of August 12, 1961. But legally dead didn't mean found. Margaret and her children still had no answers about what had happened. Where was Christopher's body? How had he died? Who was responsible? These questions haunted the family for years. Anthony, Christopher's son, reportedly spent years trying to find answers, quietly asking questions in the criminal underworld, investigating on his own. He found nothing. The case remained officially open, but inactive. Detective Sullivan retired in 1975, 14 years after Christopher's disappearance, without ever solving the case. It remained one of his professional regrets. Other detectives reviewed the case periodically when new information surfaced or when technological advances suggested new investigative approaches, but nothing ever led to answers. By the 1980s and 90s, as the people who'd known Christopher aged and died, the case became more historical curiosity than active investigation. Christopher Giordano became a footnote in Chicago organized crime history, the mob boss who'd vanished without a trace in 1961. Never found, never explained. The building where Christopher's turquoise Bel Air was buried continued operating through these decades. The ground-level retail and upper-floor offices changed tenants multiple times. The underground parking garage served customers and tenants without anyone suspecting that beneath several feet of concrete in the northeast corner of the lower level lay a vintage automobile containing human remains. And there it stayed, hidden perfectly for 62 years. The 62 years between Christopher Giordano's disappearance in August 1961 and the discovery of his remains in March 2023 saw Chicago transform in ways Christopher would never have imagined. The city's organized crime structure that had dominated the early 1960s gradually declined under federal prosecution and changing social conditions. The neighborhoods where Christopher had operated changed demographically and economically. The building where his body lay hidden changed purposes and ownership multiple times. Margaret Giordano never remarried. She raised Anthony and Maria through their teenage years and into adulthood, always carrying the pain of not knowing what had happened to her husband. She told her children stories about Christopher, selective stories that focused on his role as a father and provider, while omitting the criminal activities that had defined much of his life. She maintained that whatever Christopher had been involved in, he'd loved his family and wouldn't have abandoned them voluntarily. Margaret died in 1998 at age 76, 37 years after Christopher's disappearance, without ever learning what had happened to him. Her death certificate listed her as a widow, though technically her husband's fate remained unknown. She was buried in Chicago Cemetery in a plot that had space reserved for Christopher, though that space remained empty. Anthony Giordano, Christopher's son, followed a completely different path than his father. He completed college, earned a law degree, and became a successful attorney practicing corporate law, about as far from his father's criminal world as possible. He married, had children, and built a legitimate, prosperous life. But he never stopped wondering what had happened to Titu, his father,
even into his 70s. Anthony would occasionally research the disappearance, reading old newspaper articles, reviewing police reports that had become public record, asking questions of people who'd known Christopher. He found no answers. Maria Giordano married and moved to California in the 1970s, creating physical and emotional distance from her father's mysterious disappearance and the dark history it represented. She rarely discussed Christopher with her own children, wanting to shield them from that part of their heritage. To Maria's children, their grandfather was a historical mystery, a story about someone they'd never known who'd vanished in 1961. The building at the center of this story, the commercial structure built in 1958 with an underground parking garage, continued operating throughout these decades with various purposes. The ground floor retail spaces housed a succession of businesses: a grocery store in the early 60s, a furniture store in the 70s, various shops and offices in subsequent decades. The upper floors remained office space, housing insurance agencies, accounting firms, small businesses. The underground parking garage served customers and tenants without incident. Cars entered and exited daily. The concrete floor, including the suspiciously thick section in the northeast corner of the lower level, bore the weight of thousands of vehicles over 6 decades. Paint was applied to mark parking spaces. Minor repairs were made to lighting and drainage systems, but no one ever questioned why one section of floor was significantly thicker than the rest. It was just how the building was constructed. The construction of that unusually thick section of concrete had occurred in August 1961. According to building records that would later be examined, the records showed that additional concrete work had been performed in the lower parking level during the second week of August 1961. The work had been billed as structural reinforcement and repair of foundation issues. The construction company that performed the work, Castellano Brothers Construction, had connections to organized crime figures in Chicago during that era. Though this wasn't unusual in Chicago construction at the time. Many legitimate construction companies had relationships with or were controlled by criminal organizations. The records didn't specify exactly what the additional concrete work entailed or why it was necessary. They simply documented that concrete had been poured, that the work had been completed over 2 days, and that payment had been made. The work had apparently been done at night, when the building was closed and the parking garage empty. No one questioned this at the time. Night work was common in construction to avoid disrupting business operations. What those records documented, though no one would understand this until 62 years later, was the burial of Christopher Giordano. Somehow, someone with access to the building and connections to a construction company had arranged for Christopher's car with his body inside to be placed in a pit dug in the parking garage floor, and then for that pit to be filled with concrete. The thickness of the concrete, approximately 4 feet, ensured the car would never be accidentally discovered through normal maintenance or repairs. It was a nearly perfect hiding place. Unlike burying a body in the soil, where decomposition creates gases that might cause soil settling, or where animals might disturb the site, encasing a car and body in concrete created a permanent, sealed tomb. The concrete protected the car and remains from environmental factors. The location inside a building beneath the floor that supported regular traffic meant the site would be highly secure.
Never be excavated unless the building itself was demolished or extensively renovated. For 62 years, the secret remained hidden. The people who'd arranged Christopher's burial either died or kept their knowledge secret. The building changed owners. The original construction company went out of business. Records were filed away in archives, and beneath the parking garage floor in his turquoise Chevrolet Bel Air, Christopher Giordano sat behind the wheel, waiting in his concrete tomb to be discovered. By 2023, the building that had stood since 1958 was showing its age. Modern commercial real estate had moved toward different designs. The building systems, electrical, plumbing, HVAC, were outdated. The underground parking garage, once a selling point, had become a liability.
The low ceiling height meant modern SUVs and trucks had difficulty maneuvering. The drainage system frequently backed up. The concrete showed cracks and deterioration from 65 years of Chicago weather cycles. In January 2023, a development company purchased the building with plans for extensive renovation. The upper floors would be converted to modern apartments. The ground floor would be reconfigured for contemporary retail. And critically, the underground parking garage would be completely rebuilt to meet current codes and accommodate modern vehicles. Structural engineers who inspected the parking garage noted that the lower level's floor would need complete replacement. The concrete was old, cracked in places, and not up to current standards for structural capacity or drainage. The plan was to break up the old concrete, excavate to proper depth, install new drainage systems and utilities, and pour fresh concrete with appropriate reinforcement. Matthew Smith was assigned to the demolition crew working in the parking garage. On March 14, 2023, Matthew was working in the lower level of the garage with a pneumatic jackhammer, breaking up the old concrete floor section by section. The work was loud, dusty, and physically demanding, but it was straightforward. Most of the concrete was 6 to 8 inches thick and broke up readily under the jackhammer's repeated impacts. Around 11 a.m., Matthew moved to a section in the northeast corner of the lower level. His jackhammer bit into the concrete, and immediately he felt the difference. This concrete was much denser and deeper than what he'd been breaking up all morning. The jackhammer struggled to penetrate. Matthew applied more pressure, working the tool harder, driving it deeper into this anomalous section. 1 foot deep, the concrete kept going. 2 feet deep, still solid concrete, no sign of reaching the bottom. 3 feet deep. Matthew stopped and called to his supervisor, Carlos Martinez, who was working in another part of the garage. Carlos came over to examine the situation. "This doesn't make sense," Carlos said, looking at the depth of concrete Matthew had penetrated without reaching the bottom. "Parking garage floors aren't this thick. There's no reason for concrete this deep." They discussed possibilities. Maybe there was an old utility vault underneath that had been filled in. Maybe there was some structural issue that had required reinforcement. But 4 feet of concrete in a single section of floor was highly unusual and suggested something had been deliberately buried. "Keep going carefully," Carlos instructed. "Let's see what's down there. Stop if you hit anything that isn't concrete." Matthew resumed work, proceeding more slowly and carefully. At approximately 4 feet deep, the jackhammer struck something that produced a distinctly different sound, a metallic clang rather than the dull impact of concrete breaking. Matthew stopped immediately and cleared away loose concrete debris to see what he'd struck. There, emerging from the gray concrete dust, was a flash of chrome. Smooth, curved, corroded, but unmistakable chrome metal that looked like part of an automobile. Matthew cleared more debris by hand, revealing more of the chrome surface. It was curved in the distinctive shape of a car bumper, the styling characteristic of American cars from the late 1950s or early 1960s.